Moments before she sold the last memory of her fallen son, an elderly woman stood trembling in a pawn shop while strangers laughed at her worn coat and fading voice. They didn't know the name carved into that blade, and they didn't know God sometimes waits until the final moment to reveal the truth. What happened next would change everything. Tell us where you're watching from, comment, God sees all, if you believe no sacrifice is forgotten, and subscribe for more stories of faith and quiet miracles. A cold, gray wind drifted through the narrow streets of Charleston, rattling loose signs and whispering against the glass windows of a quiet military pawn shop. Evelyn Carter paused at the door before stepping inside. She was about 75, dark-skinned, thin as if time had slowly carved pieces of her away, her silver hair tied in a low bun that had loosened slightly during the walk. Her brown coat hung heavy on her shoulders, worn at the edges, carrying years of winters and silent endurance. In her hands, she held a small, weathered bag, its fabric faded, its seams fragile, like something that had survived more than it should have. The bell above the door rang softly, but no one greeted her. Behind the counter stood two men. The first, Mason Reed, around 30, white, short brown hair, neatly styled, wore a light shirt with a black apron. His arms were crossed, posture leaning back in a way that suggested ownership over the space. His lips curved into a smirk the moment he noticed Evelyn. He had grown used to judging people quickly. Years of working here had taught him that appearances often meant profit or waste. Beside him was Tyler Quinn, slightly older, about 35, with darker hair and the same uniform. He leaned forward casually, one hand resting on the counter, the other pointing lazily toward Evelyn's bag as he chuckled under his breath. Tyler had the kind of humor that fed on discomfort. He laughed first, thought later. Evelyn walked slowly toward them, each step measured. The wooden floor creaked beneath her shoes, echoing louder than it should have. For a brief moment, she hesitated not out of fear, but out of memory. 8 years ago, she had stood in a different room, holding a folded flag instead of a worn bag. Back then, the silence had meant loss. Today, it meant survival. She placed the bag on the counter. Her hands trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from the weight of what she was about to do. Inside that bag was not just metal and paper. It was the last proof that her son had existed beyond a photograph on a wall. "I would like to sell these," she said quietly. Mason exchanged a quick glance with Tyler, the kind of glance that carried an entire conversation without words. Tyler snorted softly. "Let's see what we've got," Mason said, his tone overly polite but hollow. Evelyn opened the bag slowly. First came the knife military issued, its blade worn but still sharp, the name Michael Carter engraved along the handle, then the Marine Corps ID tag, then a medal, dulled with time but still carrying a quiet dignity, and finally, a sealed envelope, yellowed at the edges, untouched. Tyler leaned in, squinting at the items before letting out a small laugh. "Where'd you get all this?" he asked, his voice light but edged. "Garage sale?" Mason picked up the knife, turning it between his fingers. "You know," he added, "people try this all the time. Old military stuff, fake names, hoping for sympathy money." Evelyn said nothing. Inside her chest, something tightened, but it was not new. She had heard variations of this tone before, from clerks, from officials, from strangers who saw only her coat, her age, her silence. Each time, she had chosen not to fight. Not because she couldn't, but because she was tired of explaining a life no one truly wanted to hear. Her fingers moved slightly, resting on the envelope. She had never opened it. Not because she didn't want to know what was inside, but because opening it would make everything final. As long as it remained sealed, there was still a fragile illusion that something had been left unsaid, something unfinished, something still alive. Tyler laughed again, louder this time. "This medal? Could buy one just like it online," he said, pointing. "Not worth much." Mason nodded, already lowering the items back onto the counter. "Tell you what," he said, sliding them slightly away from Evelyn as if distancing himself from the story they carried. "I can give you $50 for the lot." 50. The number hung in the air like an insult too small to even be called cruel. Evelyn looked at the items. Her son's name, his hands, his last days, all reduced to a number that wouldn't even cover a week of food. For a brief second, her eyes closed. And in that darkness, she saw him again not as a memory, but as a presence. Laughing, young, alive. The way he used to stand in the doorway before leaving, always turning back one last time. "Take care of yourself, Mom," he had said. She had nodded back then. She had promised. Now, standing here, she wondered if this was what keeping that promise looked like, letting go of the last pieces of him just to survive another month. Her grip on the envelope tightened. "I don't need much," she whispered. "Just enough." Mason shrugged. "That's the offer." Tyler leaned back, already losing interest. "Or you can try somewhere else," he added. "If anyone else even believes this story." Evelyn didn't respond. She simply stood there, her posture straight despite the exhaustion pressing into her bones. There was something unyielding in her stillness, not pride, not defiance, but endurance. And then, the door opened. The bell rang again, sharper this time. A man stepped inside. He was in his mid-50s, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a formal military uniform adorned with rows of medals that caught the dim light. His name was Colonel Richard Hayes. His face was stern, lined by years of command and decisions that had cost lives. In his right hand, he carried a black case. His eyes moved quickly, scanning the room not out of curiosity but habit, a soldier's instinct that never faded. He took one step forward, then stopped. His gaze landed on the knife, then shifted, slowly, to the envelope. The world seemed to narrow around that moment. The case slipped from his hand, hitting the floor with a dull thud. Mason flinched. Tyler straightened. But Richard didn't notice them. His eyes were fixed on Evelyn, and when he spoke, his voice was no longer steady. "That letter," he said, barely above a whisper. "Why haven't you opened it?" Silence fell, and something unseen began to change. Colonel Richard Hayes didn't move for a long moment, as if time itself had slowed around him. His sharp eyes were locked on the envelope, resting beneath Evelyn's trembling fingers. The shop, once filled with careless laughter, now held a silence so heavy it pressed against every breath. He stepped closer, boots firm against the wooden floor, each step deliberate. Years of command lived in that movement, decisions made in seconds, lives carried in memory. His uniform caught the dim light, rows of medals resting against his chest like quiet echoes of war. But when he looked at Evelyn, something in him softened. "Mrs. Carter," he said gently, his voice lower now, stripped of rank and authority. "You probably don't remember me." Evelyn lifted her eyes. They were tired but not weak. She studied him carefully, searching through years that had blurred into grief. "You were there," she whispered. "At the funeral." Richard nodded once. That day had never left him, the folded flag, the gunfire echoing into the sky, and her standing still, unshaken, as if she had decided not to fall apart in front of the world. Behind the counter, Mason shifted his weight, suddenly unsure where to look. Tyler's usual smirk had disappeared, replaced by a stiffness that didn't belong to him. They didn't understand what was happening, but they could feel it. Something heavier than pride had entered the room. Richard's gaze dropped to the knife. His fingers hovered over the engraved name before touching it lightly. "Michael carried this everywhere," he said quietly. "Wouldn't go anywhere without it." The words were simple, but they landed differently now. Mason swallowed. Tyler looked down. Then Richard straightened, and for the first time, his full attention turned to them. "Do you boys have any idea what you just laughed at?" The question didn't come loud. It didn't need to. Neither of them answered. "We didn't know," Mason muttered, his voice smaller than before. Richard tilted his head slightly, studying him. "No," he said. "You didn't." A pause followed. Not empty, heavy. Then he gestured toward Evelyn without taking his eyes off them. "That woman right there is the reason I'm still alive." Tyler blinked. Mason froze. Richard exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting somewhere far away, somewhere neither of them could follow. "8 years ago," he began, "we walked into a situation we weren't supposed to survive." His hand moved instinctively to his side, pressing lightly, as if remembering pain that never truly left. Bad intel, wrong timing, everything collapsed in minutes. Evelyn didn't move, but something in her eyes changed. Not surprise, not pride, recognition. "Men dropped fast," Richard continued. "Too fast. The room felt smaller now. Your son didn't run, he said, glancing briefly at Evelyn. He went back. Mason slowly lifted his head. Tyler's breath caught. He went back into the fire, Richard said, again and again, pulling men out who couldn't move. He paused. Just for a second. I was the last one. Silence tightened around them. By the time he reached me, I could barely see, Richard said. But I remember him. His jaw tightened slightly. He grabbed me, told me I wasn't dying that day. A faint shadow of a smile passed across his face, gone almost instantly. That was Michael, he added. He didn't hesitate. He decided. Mason looked down again, shame creeping into his posture. Tyler shifted, restless, uncomfortable inside his own skin. Richard straightened, the memory settling back behind his eyes like a storm fading but never gone. He got me out, he said simply. A long silence followed. Then his voice dropped, quieter now. What you don't know. His eyes moved slowly to the envelope. Is that what happened that night? Isn't what the report says. Mason frowned. Tyler looked up, confused. Richard turned back to Evelyn. And the fact that you never opened that letter, he said carefully, means you don't know the truth either. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the envelope. For the first time, something cracked through her calm, not fear, not grief, hesitation. The kind that comes when a door long closed begins to open. Richard didn't move closer. He didn't push. He simply stood there, waiting, as if he understood that some truths carried their own weight and had to be faced willingly. The shop remained silent. But something had shifted, and deep within that stillness, one thing became clear. Michael Carter's story was far from over. The silence in the shop did not break, it deepened, like something sinking beneath still water. Colonel Richard Hayes stood motionless for a moment, his fingers resting just inches from the sealed envelope, as if even touching it required permission. The faint hum of the overhead lights filled the space, replacing the laughter that once lived there. Evelyn Carter did not pull her hand away. Her thin fingers, worn by time and years of quiet struggle, remained pressed against the paper. The envelope felt heavier now, not because of what it weighed, but because of what it might finally reveal. I never opened it, she said softly. Her voice carried no shame, only truth. Richard looked at her, studying the lines on her face, the strength hidden beneath exhaustion. Why? He asked, though part of him already knew. Evelyn's eyes drifted down to the envelope. Because if I did, she whispered, it would mean he was really gone. The words settled in the room like dust after a storm. Mason lowered his gaze. Tyler didn't move at all. Neither of them had anything left to say. Richard inhaled slowly, then nodded once, not in agreement, but in understanding. He had seen men cling to far less just to survive a single night. Carefully, he reached forward. His fingers touched the edge of the envelope. For a brief second, Evelyn's hand tightened instinctively, a quiet resistance, like a mother holding on to the last thread of her child. But then, she let go. The paper made a soft sound as Richard broke the seal. It was a small sound, but in that moment, it felt louder than anything that had come before. He unfolded the letter slowly. Inside, there were two things: a handwritten note and a second document typed, stamped, official. Richard's eyes moved first to the handwriting. He recognized it instantly. Michael's. The room faded for a moment as he read. Mom, the letter began. If you're reading this, then things didn't go the way we hoped. Richard paused, his jaw tightening slightly. He always wrote like that, he murmured. Straight to the point. Evelyn didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the paper, as if she could feel her son's voice returning through it. Richard continued reading, his voice steady, though quieter now. I need you to know something, he read. What happened out here wasn't supposed to happen. Mason glanced up. Tyler frowned slightly. Richard's eyes flicked briefly to the second document, then back to the letter. We were sent in with intel that said the area was clear, he continued. It wasn't. Someone made a call, and it was wrong. The air in the shop shifted again. Evelyn's fingers curled slightly at her side. He knew, Richard said softly, more to himself than anyone else. He went on. I tried to radio it in, he read. Tried to tell them we were walking into something bad. But by the time anyone listened, it was too late. Tyler swallowed. Mason's expression hardened, not in arrogance, but in the uncomfortable realization of something far beyond his understanding. Richard lowered the letter slightly. He saw it coming, he said. Then he lifted the second document. It was heavier, official, cold. A report. Stamped, signed, filed, forgotten. Richard's eyes narrowed as he scanned it. The muscles in his jaw tightened again, but this time there was something else behind it: anger. Controlled, but unmistakable. This, he said slowly, this isn't the version they released. Mason looked up. What do you mean? Richard didn't answer right away. Instead, he read a line aloud. Engagement occurred due to unforeseen hostile presence. He let the words hang. Then he shook his head. That's not what happened, he said quietly. Evelyn's eyes lifted toward him. Richard looked at her now, not as a soldier, not as an officer, but as a man who had carried a truth too long. Your son tried to stop it, he said. He knew the intel was wrong. The words struck deeper than any insult ever could. He didn't just save lives, Richard continued. He tried to prevent the entire situation. Evelyn's breathing slowed. Not heavier, just deeper. And when it all went wrong, Richard added, he stayed anyway. A long silence followed, the kind that doesn't ask for words. Mason looked at the knife again. Tyler stared at the floor. Richard folded the letter carefully, as if it were something sacred. He wrote this knowing he might not come back, he said. Then his voice lowered, and he still chose to protect everyone else. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. For the first time, not in 8 years, she was hearing her son speak again, not through memory, not through imagination, but through truth. Richard exhaled slowly. They buried this, he said. The mistake, the warning, everything. His eyes hardened slightly. But they couldn't bury him. The room held still. And in that quiet, one truth became undeniable. Michael Carter had not only died a hero, he had been silenced as one. The paper in Richard Hayes's hands felt heavier than any weapon he had ever carried. For a long moment, no one spoke. The letter rested against the counter, the ink of Michael's words still fresh in memory, but the truth it revealed, older than the silence that followed it. The official report lay beside it, cold and impersonal, as if it belonged to a different world entirely. Richard exhaled slowly, his eyes still scanning the document as though searching for something that might undo what he had just read. But there was nothing. No correction, no acknowledgement, only absence. They changed it, he said finally, his voice low, controlled. They cleaned it up. Mason shifted uneasily. Tyler's arms dropped from the counter, no longer leaning, no longer relaxed. The air had turned into something else, now something neither of them could escape. Evelyn stood still, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the counter. But inside, something was unraveling. Not grief. Not yet. Something quieter. Understanding. So, he knew, she whispered. Richard nodded once. He knew the mission was wrong, he said, and he chose to carry that weight himself. He lifted the report again, tapping a line with his finger. They marked him as last to fall during extraction, Richard continued. No mention of the warning. No mention of the decision he made. Tyler frowned. Why would they leave that out? Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at Evelyn. Because if they admitted the truth, he said slowly, they'd have to admit someone above him made a mistake. The words settled hard. Mason rubbed the back of his neck, his earlier arrogance now completely gone. So they just let it stay like that? Richard's jaw tightened slightly. Sometimes, he said, the system protects itself before it protects the truth. Evelyn's fingers trembled. Not from weakness, but from something breaking open after years of being held shut. All this time, she murmured. Her voice was barely there. All this time, I thought. Maybe he didn't make it out because she couldn't finish the sentence. Because she had spent years carrying a quiet doubt, she never spoke aloud. A doubt that maybe, just maybe, her son hadn't been enough. Richard's voice softened. He was more than enough, he said. He paused, then added, they just didn't tell the whole story. The words didn't comfort her. They restored something that had been missing for years. Behind them, the shop door opened again. The bell rang softly, but no one reacted at first. A man stepped inside, older, late 60s, with a slight limp in his walk. His name was Noah Bennett, a retired Navy mechanic who had spent most of his life around men who never talked about what they carried. His gray beard was uneven, his jacket worn, but his eyes were sharp in a quiet, observant way. He paused near the entrance, sensing the tension in the room. "What I walk into?" he muttered. No one answered, but his gaze moved to the counter, to the knife, to the metal, then to Richard. Recognition flickered. "You," Noah said slowly. "I've seen that uniform before." Richard gave a small nod, but Noah's attention shifted again, this time to Evelyn, and something about her posture made him stop. "She someone important?" he asked. Mason hesitated. Then, for the first time since the beginning of the day, his voice carried no sarcasm. "She's his mother," he said quietly. Noah looked back at the knife, then at the letter, then back at Evelyn, and he nodded once, as if that explained everything. "Yeah," he said softly. "I figured." The room fell silent again. But it wasn't the same silence as before. This one carried weight. Recognition. Richard straightened slowly. His posture changed not into authority, but into decision. "They buried this," he said. Then he looked at the document again. "And I let it stay buried." Evelyn turned toward him. There was no accusation in her eyes, only a question. Richard met her gaze. "That ends now," he said. Simple words, but they carried something final. Mason looked up. "What do you mean?" Richard's expression hardened not with anger, but with resolve. "I mean," he said, "this doesn't stay in a drawer anymore." Tyler swallowed. "You're going to report it?" Richard gave a slight shake of his head. "No," he said. "I'm going to correct it." There was a difference, and everyone in the room felt it. Noah leaned slightly against the wall, arms crossed. "That's not going to be easy," he said. Richard's eyes didn't move. "It was never supposed to be," he replied. Evelyn looked down at the letter again, at the words she had been too afraid to read for 8 years. And now, too late to unread. Her son had not only died a hero, he had chosen silence, so others wouldn't carry the blame. Her fingers rested gently over his name. "Michael," she whispered. This time, it didn't sound like loss. It sounded like truth. Richard carefully folded the documents, placing them back together. Not as evidence, as something that needed to be seen. "Mrs. Carter," he said quietly. She looked up. "I'm going to make sure they know who your son really was." The room held still, and for the first time since she walked in, Evelyn didn't feel invisible. She felt seen. The morning sky over Charleston was clear for the first time in days, sunlight spilling across the white stone steps of the Memorial Hall as if the city itself had decided to remember something long forgotten. Evelyn Carter stood at the edge of the crowd, her brown coat still the same worn, quiet, unchanged, but today it did not make her invisible. People noticed her now, not because of what she wore, but because of who she was. Her hands rested gently against each other, no longer trembling, but steady in a way that came from finally understanding something she had carried for years. Beside her stood Colonel Richard Hayes, his uniform immaculate, every metal polished, every line sharp, but his expression held none of the rigid distance of command. Today, there was something more human in it, something softer, shaped by memory and responsibility. He had spent the past weeks reopening reports, calling in favors, facing resistance from old chains of command that preferred silence over truth. But he had not stopped. And now, they were here. Inside the hall, rows of chairs filled quickly. Among the crowd were veterans, officers, and civilians, some curious, some respectful, some unaware that they were about to witness a story being restored. Near the back, Mason Reed and Tyler Quinn stood side by side, both in simple clothes, no longer hiding behind a counter. Their posture had changed. Mason's shoulders were slightly lowered, as if carrying something unseen. Tyler, usually restless, stood still, hands clasped tightly in front of him. Neither spoke. They didn't belong to this world, but they had been allowed to see it. A new figure stepped onto the stage. Major Elena Brooks, early 40s, composed, her dark hair tied neatly beneath her service cap, carried herself with the calm authority of someone who had learned discipline through both war and loss. Years earlier, she had lost her younger brother in combat, a loss that shaped her into someone who refused to let names disappear into paperwork. She held a folder in her hands, the same kind that had once buried Michael's truth. The room quieted. Elena's voice was clear, steady. "Today," she began, "we correct a story that was never fully told." Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. "Not in pain. In release." Elena continued, recounting the mission, not the edited version, not the shortened report, but the truth. She spoke of the failed intel, the ambush, the chaos that followed. And then, she spoke of Michael Carter, how he had recognized the danger before it unfolded, how he had tried to warn command, how he had gone back again and again into fire no one should have survived, and finally, how he had stayed behind, not because he was ordered to, but because he chose to. The words did not rush. They settled, and for the first time the silence in that room honored him. Richard stepped forward when Elena finished. In his hands was a small wooden box, new, polished, its surface catching the light in a way the old one never had, but the weight it carried was far older. He stopped in front of Evelyn. For a brief second, neither spoke. Then he opened the box. Inside rested the metal, brighter, heavier, undeniable. Beneath it, neatly placed, was the full report. No omissions, no edits, no silence. And folded carefully at the bottom, the letter. Richard's voice lowered. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "this belongs to you." Evelyn reached forward slowly. Her fingers touched the metal first, but not like something valuable, like something familiar. Then she unfolded the letter. Her eyes moved across the final lines, and this time, she didn't stop herself. "Mom," she read softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "don't worry about me. The only thing I'm afraid of is you being alone, and no one knowing how hard I tried." The words broke something, but not in the way grief once had. This time, it healed. Behind her, Mason lowered his head. Tyler wiped at his eyes quickly, as if embarrassed to be seen, feeling something he didn't yet know how to name. They had come expecting to witness a ceremony. Instead, they had witnessed truth. Evelyn closed the letter gently. For a moment, she held it against her chest, not as something lost, but as something returned. The ceremony ended without applause at first, just silence. Then, slowly, people stood, not out of obligation, out of respect. Later, as the crowd thinned and the sunlight shifted toward evening, Evelyn walked out of the hall. Richard stood beside her, but he did not guide her. He didn't need to. She walked differently now. Not stronger, but lighter. When she returned home, the room looked the same worn chair, the same quiet walls, the same small table by the window. She placed the new wooden box beside the old bag. For a moment, she looked at both. One held survival, the other, truth. She reached out, resting her hand gently across them. And for the first time in 8 years, she did not feel like her son had been left behind. Because now, the world knew he had never stopped fighting. In a quiet corner of the world, where a mother once stood alone with nothing but a worn bag and a fading memory, something unseen was already at work. Not loud, not sudden, but patient like a whisper carried by the wind, like a hand that waits until the right moment to gently lift what has been buried too long. Because sometimes, what we call coincidence is not coincidence at all. It is grace. Evelyn thought she had lost everything, her son, his story, even the meaning behind his sacrifice. But truth has a way of finding its way back, like light slipping through cracks no matter how long the darkness lasts. And maybe, just maybe, that moment when the door opened, when the right person walked in at the exact second she needed it most, was not luck. It was God. A quiet reminder that no sacrifice is ever truly forgotten, that no tear goes unseen, that even when the world overlooks you, heaven does not. And in our own lives, we may not carry medals or letters from war, but we all carry something: pain, silence, stories no one has asked about. And just like Evelyn, there may come a day when truth finds us again, when what was lost is returned in a way we never expected. So if this story touched something in your heart, take a moment. Share it with someone who needs to believe again. Leave a comment and tell us, have you ever felt like something in your life was guided by something greater? And if you believe that no one should ever be judged by what we see on the outside, subscribe to the channel, because there are many more quiet stories waiting to be heard. May God bless you, protect you, and walk beside you even in the moments when you feel alone. Because sometimes, the miracle is not that the story changes. It's that the truth finally finds its way home.
If you enjoyed this story, don't go away. Drop a comment, tell us where you watching from, and subscribe to Hidden Black Tale for more.